Our first edition is being presented by Dr. Mike Hutjens. Our next one will be in October 21. Neil Wenninger from Dairyland Labs will present on what does this season's forages looks like as they've done testing. In November, Dr. James Coltis from Iowa State will be presenting on information on the new sire summaries. And the final one in December for 2020 will be on stress, communication, and the family. And that will be presented by Dr. Larry Tranel, who's one of the dairy specialists here at Iowa State University. It is indeed an honor for me to introduce Dr. Mike Hutjens. He was raised on a Holstein farm near Green Bay, Wisconsin, and earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He started out his career as an extension dairy specialist at the University of Minnesota, and he had presented a national championship dairy judging team at the 1978 World Dairy Expo. Since '79, he's been a member of the University of Illinois Animal Science Department as the extension dairy specialist. Obviously, one of the most recognizable speakers in our dairy industry. He has done consistently 70, 80 meetings, covered nearly the entire United States, plus 17 or 18 foreign countries. He has been recognized in our industry, and in 2008 was Service Person of the Year, recognized by the World Dairy Expo. Certainly a sought-after speaker, and we're delighted to have him in this introductory edition of our monthly series. Dr. Hutchinson, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for that very kind introduction, and welcome. I'm hoping all of you will find that the information useful, that you can go right to your farms or your companies and apply it out there on your program. And so our title for today is gearing up for 6.5 pounds of solids, and that solids are going to be primarily milk fat and milk protein. So certainly a lot of interest in this topic, so let's go on.
Mike, you muted.
Moving right. No, I think I'm back now, right? Yep. Somehow I saw the sign. Am I back?
Yep.
Okay, so we're all set to go. Very good. Fred, don't be afraid to jump in if something breaks down. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and we're going to talk about milk components. Certainly, it's a key topic because, first of all, farmers are paid for pounds of milk fat and milk protein almost in all our milk markets except in the southeast portion. Second of all, milk protein is, in my view, going to be very important in the future as it's linked to cheese production and yogurt utilization, and therefore consumers really vote with their dollars to buy those dairy products right now compared to such things as fluid milk. And of course, if you're a dairy farmer, we know milk fat and milk protein can reflect the feeding and the rumen management on the farm. So certainly, we all know in the last 6 to 8 months with COVID-19, things have really changed. And let's take a quick look at that, and we can see I selected 3 different months, looking at what we're pricing in 2020. In March, of course, we are now in COVID, and we saw those dramatic drops of 40% in milk. And so you can see protein was worth $2.09 a pound, milk fat $1.38, and class 3 milk was $12.100. Pretty spooky time. We then go to June and we saw the big rebound that occurred here. Some of that had to do with actions by our milk processors. Some of that had to do with government payments. Some of that had to do with the food box program. But suddenly milk protein doubles. $4.54 a pound. Butterfat came back slightly. Some of you will remember 3 or 4 years ago when milk fat was $3 a pound and the whole world wanted milk fat. And of course the class 3 price $21. I thought we'd just add the August prices there. You can see they're still relatively high. I think we're going to see some softening in these numbers here in the future, but you can see, which is really unusual, to see that basically almost 2.5 times more valuable milk protein than milk fat. And again, that's price around $19.77. Okay, get out your pencils, get out your marks, and again, you can listen to these PowerPoints, or if you need them, let me know. I'll be glad to give them to you. Let's set some benchmarks and maybe some opportunities on dairy farms. The first question is, well, what should those numbers be? And so we went to the Hoards Dairyman-August issue and looked at milk fat, milk protein relationships. So let's pick on Holstein. If you look at that data, by the way, you'll see that is DHIR data. That was 3.89 was the fat test there. Interesting, Holstein's about the only breed that has really shifted much on milk fat. Milk protein, and that is true protein, by the way, 3.09. And so if you divide the protein into the fat, that ratio is about 79%. If you do the reciprocal of that, in which you will take and go in and divide the fat into the protein, that's about 1.26. So either numbers, that's a useful number. The first question is, what is that number on your farm? Now, what is that ratio of fat and protein? And then also, what are the actual levels that are being produced on the farm? So that's a nice benchmark to look at to see if there's an opportunity on your farm or with your clients. Then we're going to take a look at the actual pounds of fat and protein. So in that article in Hoards Dairyman, they do list these numbers. Be well aware at the top, you can see this is the 2019 data. It was published in 2020, but this is DHIR data with 305 days in milk, 2x ME adjusted. So just be aware that those numbers have been adjusted. And now you can see the various breeds all listed there. And that's the pounds of milk. And by the way, the milking shorthorn should be 18,858. Just saw that this morning. And so you may want to just be aware of that. I then plug in the fat test and protein that we had in the previous slide. And now you can see the Holsteins are producing, using this database, 6.28 pounds of fat and protein. We don't put lactose in here or other solids because they don't vary very much and they don't have near the impact on price that typically in that 14 or 15 cents a pound range. So you can see Holsteins at 6.28, so very close to our theme to the day of 6.25 pounds of fat and protein. Jerseys come in second at 5.61, and I'll let you read the rest of the numbers. So now that's another message you need to do if you're a dairy farmer or consultant, and that is how many pounds is being produced on that farm or on your farm or whatever the situation is if you're a consultant, a veterinarian working with a feed company, or if you're the actual dairy farmer. So certainly another nice benchmark to see kind of by breed, just to give an idea where you are, because I know some of you do not have Holsteins and want to know where does my breed shake out. The third point for take-home messages here is to see if there's opportunities. Is kind of a very detailed PowerPoint, but let's go through it, and I think it'll make sense, and you can always come back and get these printed off if you wish. We went back to the Raleigh Processing Center, and we asked them in 2017, could you look at various levels of milk yield, peak milk, and also milk components? And so what you're going to see here is four different levels of milk production. For some of you that are more comfortable in kilos, it's all way on the right side, but we'll stay. And so we took a below average herd. That's very typical. 23,000 pounds of Holstein milk is very typical. Our more elite herds at 26, and then of course our very best herds at 30,000 pounds of milk. If you come down to the bottom, you're going to see that Iowa is in this. So your data is here. We had 1,000 herds in this category of 19,000. We had nearly 2,000 herds in the 23,000 pound herd average, 1,000 herds at 27,000 pound herd average, and 292 herds in the 30,000 pound milk production level. So that's what these numbers mean. That's how many herds in Iowa you are part of this database. And then we have first lactation, second lactation, and third plus. So we look at different parities or lactation numbers. And so what you have then across over here on the left side is fat percentage, and that is from 0 to 40 days in milk, 40 to 100, 1 to 200, and 200 above. And the red numbers are opportunities. And shows on the milk fat side of the equation, the lower producing herds really struggle to reach that 3.7, 3.8 in the first 100 days. So there's an opportunity. That could also be occurring in some higher producing herds as well. Notice we come down, and that's first lactation animals. And that may, why are they getting hit there? And that may be due to their age, their size, mature development here, competition at the feed bunk. I don't know. I can't answer that question. Notice we go down again to the second lactation heifers, and they are also a bit low. And then you come down to the third lactation and above, and they seem to be fine. So maybe it has to do with feed intake and body size. Now here's the wake-up message. Look over here. Here's milk protein. Same format there, but look at in the first 100 days, all these herds, I don't care if they're first lactation or if they're highest producing herds, they're all below 3% true protein. And that's a real opportunity. Could that mean that we don't have adequate amino acids getting to those animals? More about that a bit later. Are not eating much dry matter. But the point is, every dairy farmer here in Iowa should be looking at that if they're on DHI test, because you get it every month. And every month you have a report card if you want to wish to see if you can change those numbers, because with today's components pricing, especially on protein, you and I are leaving a lot of money on the table if we are in fact not getting up to those numbers that we're trying to reach at that point. So again, a very busy slide at this point. And again, this is just dividing the fat into the protein. That should be around a 1.26. So you can see they're relatively close here, but still we're missing protein. We are missing protein. So again, what's going on in the herd? Well, one of the questions is, what's it going to take to get to my title of the talk, 6.5 pounds of milk fat and milk protein? And so I look at Holstein's 3 scenarios. This is the Hoards Dairyman right here. So if we took the milk, and there's that same number, 6.28 pounds, and that was roughly 90 pounds of milk when I divided the total milk yield by 305 days in milk. Now you'll take a look, here would be our top herds at 100 pounds of milk. And yes, we have herds at 100 pounds of milk. Our top herd in Illinois last year had 102 pounds of milk was their average, with a 4 fat and a 3.2 protein. So you can do the math very quickly. You can see they're in excess of 7.2 pounds of product out there on the program. I then go down to 80 pounds of milk, and you can see that's going to generate somewhere around 5.6 pounds. So obviously we have 2 opportunities. Either you increase the components that were on the Hoards page, or you get more milk from them. And then we down look at our jerseys, and sure enough, you can see here in my jerseys, we got about 5.6 pounds of milk and a product there, and that was an average of 65 pounds of milk, and that's a really pretty good milk production for jerseys. You can see to get over 6.25 or 6.5, or here 6.8, it would take 80 pounds of milk. So that's a lot of milk. And yet herds here in the United States are achieving those kinds of numbers. So it's another set of goals to look at, determine where we're at and what's going on. Okay, let's now look at those 2 components briefly, and we'll move on. So that's the first part of the study, and that is what is your goals, or what is normal for your breed, what can you anticipate reaching for here in the near future. So let's take a quick review of evaluating milk fat. And if we look at milk fat, there are 2 basic sources, and most researchers suggest about half of the milk fat that you harvest every day is coming from volatile fatty acids. Those are VFAs produced in the rumen. These are shorter chain volatile fatty acids, meaning C4 means a carbon length of 4 carbons hooked together. C14 means 14 of those dudes hooked together. They also synthesize some of the C16. You'll see that here in just a minute. So what's the precursors to make that? Well, they're going to be primarily rumen acetate and butyrate, are going to be the building blocks the mammary gland does to make that. So anything you and I might do to lower those building blocks, not to get the precursors to the mammary gland, would potentially lower butterfat test. That's important. We'll discuss some of those here in just a minute. The other half comes what we call, or I call, blood lipids. And that's going to come from dietary fats and oils. And so if you're feeding a fuzzy cottonseed or roasted soybeans, something like that, that would be a source of the dietary fat. Another source would be animal fat. If I buy animal fat, or commercial sources, some of the fatty acids that you can buy commercially. More about that a bit later as well. Also, you can get another source of blood lipids that's going to be body fat mobilization. Some of you will recognize NEFA. Stands for non-esterified fatty acids. So these sources come from the body itself, and it goes in the bloodstream, and the mammary gland has now that precursor. And of course, there is some fatty acid lipids being produced by the liver and also by the rumen microbes. So those are your two sources, and roughly those ratios there. The next several PowerPoints comes from Dave Barbano from Cornell University, so I want to give him credit for that. And so here's your structure of fatty acid. Now a lot of things to learn here, but you can see over here on the right side, and I think my cursor, you might be able to see that. This is the glycerol molecule, and then we have 3 fatty acids hooked to that. And of course, we'll talk more about that right now. So that's the structure of the milk fat itself. We then look at how much in ratios. And in fact, they are now doing this testing up in the northeastern part of the United States. And I think we'll see that come here to the Midwest as well. We'll take a bulk milk sample, and we will actually look at what percent are what we call de novo synthesis. That means the mammary gland makes that out of volatile fatty acids. And you can see that number varies from 18%, which means very low levels. That's going to be a low fat test herd, and as high as 30%. You then come over here, and this is the preformed. We just talked about that's the blood lipids. And you can see these are primarily long-chain saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids, and they go all the way from 30 to 45%. So if you're feeding some of the oil seeds, you're probably up in that 40% level. And then you can see both circles overlap, and that creates a little bit more of a problem to interpret, but it is what it is. And that's your C16 saturated, that's palmitic acid, and this is your unsaturated palmitic acid, and it too can make up about, you can see about 34%. So can you imagine if your milk co-op did this analysis? It takes a different kind of machine that some of these labs have, but you got this, and you start seeing this number going down. In other words, instead of being up around 25, 28%, it goes down to 20 or even 18%. That would be your clue that something is not going right in the rumen, or in the feeding program, or in rumen health. And the same thing up here. If you see really high levels over here, it means that you're buying a lot of that material or taking it off the back of the cow. So this is kind of exciting stuff to see, and something I look forward to hopefully seeing coming in some of our testing centers, and also coming into our milk plants, because the milk plant would be really key. Wouldn't you love to have these ratios along with your butterfat test, and gives you a bit of a diagnostic tool of what's going on. Then so here's the schematic again from Dave Barbano. Here's my cow. She eats the feed. She ferments in the rumen. We made acetate butyrate. It goes in the bloodstream. It goes to the mammary gland, and voila, you have milk fat test. And that's probably going to make up, maybe a third of the milk fat right there coming from that sources there. The next one, of course, is preformed fatty acids. We already talked about them briefly. The cow eats feed. It goes into the rumen. There's some saturation going on there, which can have some negative effects on fiber digestibility. It goes in the bloodstream. Also, we've got some fatty acids coming from adipose tissue, and that's being as NEFAs, and those go to the mammary gland, and your cow makes milk fat out of that as well. So remember this, if cows are losing a lot of body weight, generally speaking, we tend to see higher butterfat tests. We call that borrowing from the bank, which means at some point that's going to run out, and at some point you're going to have to pay it back in the cow's lactation gestation cycle. Okay, another interesting thing that Rick Grant's group at the Minor Institute did is looked at some factors that really affected the mammary gland's ability to synthesize fatty acids or find those resources. And basically, no big surprise to it online. You can see here, first of all, if the bunk space is limited, under 18 inches, we saw lower levels of fatty acids from de novo synthesis, and that reflected in lower butterfat and milk protein tests. Basically, the cows couldn't get to the feed or were limiting on dry matter intake. Conversely, this one fits right along with it. In those farms they visited, if you had over 1.1 cows per stall, or per area, and by the way, the length we like to see here is 30 inches. If you are overloaded, over capacity, overstocking, we again see the same effect, lower synthesis of milk fat here, and the same thing as we saw above earlier, lower milk fat test as well. And then we look at adding fat. And if we feed high levels of ether extract, that's a really nice name for saying lipids or fats and oils, we may again see a decrease. So all three of these basically had lower and lower de novo synthesis of fatty acids, which means those fats may be doing something in the rumen of those cows besides contributing a precursor to the mammary gland. And of course, this is not a big surprise for you nutritionists. If we have more physically effective NDF, that's particle size, the length of the fiber, more cud chewing, that favors fiber digestibility, and therefore we saw an increase in fatty acid synthesis in those herds. So lots of neat detective stuff you can do with this if you've got those numbers and you can look at rations and housing and feeding conditions on the farm. Went back to the University of Pennsylvania. This is some much older data, just to be fair with you, and we looked at what effects did feeding fat have on milk protein test. Now this is test. Now take a look, and here's what we looked at: tallow, fuzzy cottonseed, raw soybeans, roasted soybeans, and extruded soybeans. And the bottom line is you can see that really the protein test was not impacted at all. It did impact fat tests though. And so you can see fuzzy cottonseed was a plus, and that's because that fatty acid in the cottonseed is not as slowly released because the cow has to chew the seed to release it. You can also see the same effect with roasted soybeans. Those roasted soybeans should be processed into eighths or quarter bits or piece size to avoid high levels of unsaturated fatty acids in the rumen. You can see extruded soybeans really hammered the butterfat test, but the good news is we got milk out of it. And so you have to look at how many pounds of fat would be what's the trade-off here. But that's due to the fact that extruded soybeans, actually, those of you that ever fed them or felt them, they are really oily. In other words, you take a handful of extruded soybeans and you will have oil on your hands, and therefore very available in the rumen to have some impact negatively on the rumen fermentation. So you get an idea that feeding fat has differential responses depending on the source and form of those oil seeds going into the cow. Well, let's talk about economics. Today's marketplace. I went to Michigan State, and one of their papers last year, they suggested about 20% of the inert fat, and these are primarily palmitic fatty acid research coming out of the Michigan State work here, is transferred into milk fat. So let's do a little napkin math here. If the price of your palmitic fatty acids or your commercial product here, these are dry products that flow nicely, somewhere at that time $1,040 a ton. And that ends up being about 52 cents a pound. Even I can see that number there. So if you're going to feed 1 pound, and most farmers are feeding a little bit less than a pound, typically a half to 3/4 of a pound, but if I feed 1 pound, so I fed 1 pound of added fat, that's going to cost me 52 cents. And that should get me about 2/10 of a pound increase in milk fat, and that has a value of 33 cents. Now remember, that's using today's current milk fat price, which is fairly low right now compared to where it was, especially say 6 months ago or 8 months ago or 3 years ago. So certainly the value of the components really affect that. Now this is only milk. We didn't look at its impact that it could have on fertility. We didn't look at things on body condition score changes, metabolic disorders. So we're just looking at milk fat being produced by that fat inclusion in the diet. So I think that's another take-home message that this number will change, and I'll bet you a piece of pie it'll change in the next 3 or 4 months as well. Okay, now let's do the same thing for milk protein. And come through that as well. So in the milk protein, there are really two sources of milk protein, and we go right to metabolizable protein. And let's be rather fair and clear about this. Your cow does not have a protein requirement. Your dairy cow, your dairy calves, you as a human, you have an amino acid requirement. And so that is what metabolizable protein helps us look at to see what the amino acids balance is going to be in those cows. The first source, believe it or not, is microbial protein. So anything that you and I can do to grow more microbial protein in the rumen, that means she'll have more metabolizable protein. In well-balanced rations, we may achieve up to as much as 5 pounds of microbial protein a day. These are really high-producing cows with high dry matter intakes and extremely well-balanced rumen health as well. 3 pounds, well, now we're short. And so if you could produce 5, but you're only getting 3, now you get to buy it. And that's your second part. You're going to go to rumen undegraded protein, abbreviated as RUP. And basically that is that fraction of the protein that is fed to cows that does not break down in the rumen and therefore is digested like you and I would digest our green beans or our milk casein proteins, and it breaks down to amino acids. And of course, the trick is why you balance rations is to get these in line to meet the cow's requirements. So if you're short on the top end, rumen microbes, which are going to be very cheap, that's a take-home message again. If you can grow rumen microbes in the rumen of those cows, they're not in the labor union. You've got pretty economical sources of amino acids coming into play. And of course, the undegraded protein, in most cases, you're going to be buying that or treating your soybeans with heat or something like that to generate more RUP. So this is a neat study that comes from the University of Vermont. And what they did is they looked at what our computer predicted, and that's over here on the left side, known as metabolizable protein allowed in milk. And so, and across the bottom, they said, okay, cows, tell us, what are you going to do? So in this study here, it says, well, we have the ration geared up for 80 pounds of milk for the cow, and we come over here, and sure enough, that line goes right straight through it. The other neat thing to see for you statisticians is the R squared, which means that 72% of this actual milk response was related to metabolizable protein in these studies. So it works. It really works. So that's why when you work with your nutritionist or with your computers, you want to have a modeling system that calculates metabolizable protein. What about this RUP fraction? Well, basic, nice slide. I believe this is from the NRC as listed here. We've got 3 sources. Animal proteins, and you can see blood meal, this is meat and bone meal, this is fish meal, not very common because it's really expensive here, and this would be feather meal. Then you come down here to the grain proteins. This is corn gluten meal, not feed, corn gluten meal. This would be distillers grains listed down here. This would be brewers dry grains listed there. And again, you can see they all vary as far as percentage. So if you're buying RUP, obviously a feed that's high and one of these big numbers would be a target you want to look at. And then you come down here to what we call grain byproducts. And this is soybean meal. This is going to be cottonseed meal. This is going to be canola meal. This is cottonseed meal. This is sunflower meal. So again, you can see quite a bit of variation. So that as nutritionists, you get to play and work with those back and forth. So now, with that armed with that information, let's go back to your farm and say, okay, let's figure out how we're going to try to get some of that early milk protein we saw from the Iowa database from North Carolina included in there. And there are basically 2 sources. You know what they are already, but it'll surprise you a little bit. The first one is going to be getting enough fermentable carbohydrates to drive microbial and protein yield. And remember, we can see as much as 60 to 70% of the microbial protein can be provided to that cow as for meeting her amino acid requirements. And so while it doesn't say protein, it simply says dry matter intake and a good balanced carbohydrate, and here they are listed. And so I list them as what we call rumen fermentable carbohydrates. These are the products that drive the rumen microbes. Starch levels, 24 to 28%, sugar 5 to 7%, and 10 to 12% of fermentable soluble fibers. Pectins would be certainly an example of that one as well. So just remember, this carbohydrate, which is meaning not only the type of carbohydrates, but the total dry matter intake really becomes big factors in number 1. Number 2 is looking at the protein numbers. And of course, quickly listed here, most of you online are going to be feeding somewhere around 15 to 17% crude protein. But now we break that down. That should be metabolizable protein. You take about 62, 63% of that. That would be metabolizable protein. I could have put that on as well. The type of RUP, most of you are going to be in that mid-30 range of rumen undegraded proteins for high-producing cows. And of course, the other part of the story is going to be the amino acid profile of that RUP fraction. For example, soy is very good, whereas corn products are very low in lysine. So just talk to your pig nutritionist. They'll tell you pretty quickly what's happening there. As we saw earlier, that feeding of fats or oils in the ration really is not a source of energy for the rumen microbes. I call it bypass energy. It just goes to the rumen. The bacteria try to saturate it to make it more rumen-friendly as far as that goes. Dr. Carl Davis did this work and looked at all the research done in the journal Dairy Science, and he said for every 1 pound of added fat of oil, expect to see a decrease of about 1/10 of a point. And the Penn State data backs it right up as well. And part of that probably is due to the fact that usually when you feed fat, you get more milk energy. And as a result, we don't get any more amino acids being produced. Therefore, it's a dilution effect, and that can be a cause. Another negative cause can be that if you have PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, that can have a negative effect on fiber-digesting bacteria. And fiber-digesting bacteria produce, voila, acetate and butyrate. So now hopefully you get a bit of a picture of how these factors come in and how they play in the program. The next 3 slides are very busy, and I'm keeping an eye on my watch because we want to wrap up here in the next 10 minutes or so to allow time for any questions you may have, and you can type those in any time, and we will comment on them as well. I broke down causes of low milk fat and low milk protein, and milk protein is a hot topic. Obviously, when you're getting over $4 a pound for milk protein, you're saying, wow, how can I build that? We already talked about that. What could cause it to be low on my farm? And so this could apply to some of those earlier data we saw from North Carolina. First one, of course, is protein considerations. And you can read them faster probably than I can talk them, although I can get up to 600 words per minute. But a lack of rumen-degraded protein. In other words, the bacteria need ammonia. They need amino acids. In some cases, they need peptides to really do their thing. And so we're not feeding them properly. Another risk could be that you've got a low level of rumen undegraded protein. Instead of being 32, 33% of the crude protein, it's a lower level of that. So now we're short in metabolizable protein coming there and amino acids. And as we pointed out earlier, not all RUP is created equal. And we will see blood meal is an excellent source of lysine, where soybean meal is, especially if it's heat-treated, excellent source of lysine and methionine. Fish meal is best of all, but very expensive. And of course, the corn byproducts, corn distillers, corn grain, corn itself, corn silage. A lot of corn in Iowa certainly will mean a lower level of RUP reaching the cow's small intestine as well. Another area will be the energy considerations, and we talked about that already, and that is basically either underfeeding or overfeeding. And that would, in overfeeding, the real risk there is that you're going to cause some decrease in rumen pH. That is also known as SARA, which means that you don't you have subclinical rumen acidosis going on. That's going to impact microbial protein development here, and also will decrease the ability to capture some of the rumen-degraded protein. If you underfeed, the problem you'll have there is, of course, you'll just not have enough precursors to drive rumen microbial yield as far as that goes. Another one you'll see is a lack of physically effective fiber, and they have the same effects there. Overfeeding fat, especially if they are not protected fats and they're polyunsaturated or PUFAs, that will inhibit bacterial activity, and we discussed that one as well. The third one, which some people never think much about, and that is basically non-nutrient factors. Spoiled or contaminated feeds, which could be high in wild yeast counts, resulting in mycotoxins and mold developments here, and that's going to have a negative effect on rumen bacteria. And anytime you negatively affect the bacteria, that's going to impact VFA production. Another one is probably not getting enough attention, but it sure does in the beef area, and that is how consistent we are in feeding cattle. In other words, if we're dropping feed off at 6 in the morning and today something broke or we got a late start and we drop feed in at 10 o'clock this morning, that's going to impact the rumen and dry matter intake as far as that goes. And then, of course, bunk management, simply the ability to push up feed, stability of feed, especially when we have some hot summer weather. You see a secondary fermentation going on. Those can also affect low milk protein levels. And again, goes right back to something is missing, and usually it's dry matter intake. Well, as we start going to our next topic, and that is amino acid balancing, and we're pretty much spot on time, folks at Iowa State. What about amino acid balancing? And the answer is, well, that's the real game. That is what the models will actually do for me and get the job done. So the question is, what about feeding rumen-protected amino acids? Just like I can feed commercial fat supplements, some of which are rumen-protected, I can also buy amino acids. Now, the take-home message here, you've got to protect amino acids. You're not feeding pigs anymore, so if you feed unprotected amino acids, the rumen bacteria will use them as a source of energy and in some cases to make microbial protein, but you don't want to do that. Dr. Jimmy Clark, some of you recognize that name, a world-renowned protein nutritionist here at the University of Illinois, put these 3 points together. And he says, if you are going to feed rumen-protected amino acids, one of 3 things could happen, maybe all 3. First of all, milk protein could increase. Typically 1/10 of a point. We have seen some field reports where it's 2/10 of a point, especially those cows that are below breed average or in early lactation. Excuse me. The response should be relatively quick, typically 3 to 7 days, because you are delivering amino acids to the bloodstream and right to the mammary gland, and the mammary gland says, voila, we can make more milk protein. And usually occurs in those rumen models that are low in lysine and or methionine. These rumen models will tell you how many grams you need. Typically about 60 grams of methionine, 170, 180 grams of lysine from all sources. You may also see a milk increase. In some cases it will be none. Some cases you may see as much as 5 pounds milk increase, but you may not get the protein test. What's the good news, students? Well, the good news, listeners, is that I've increased pounds of protein, and of course I'm being paid $4.40 a pound for that as far as that goes. And Dr. Clark would suggest it occurs primarily in early lactation. You might see a milk fat increase. You're saying, now wait a minute, how would I get milk fat? And the answer is, are you rumen-protected methionine? Methionine is kind of a unique product. It does some unique things in terms of liver lipids, as far as packaging, the results here. And so you could see a milk fat test increase, especially if you feed more rumen-protected methionine or a RUP source that is higher in methionine. So anyway, you might see any one of those 3 things if you go with that kind of product. Well, let's ask the economic question again. I'm going to go back and say I've got 80 pounds of milk. I did get the right amino acids there, so true protein, so I get 1/10 of a point, or about 0.08 of a pound of milk protein. You think, well, that doesn't sound like much, Mike. Wait and see. So I got an increase. Remember, in some cases, you may actually see 2/10 of a pound here, then you just double the numbers. Milk protein right now is worth $4.44 a pound, which means I'm going to have an extra 35 cents more income if my cows understand the research and read the book and listen to this webinar, and I get 0.08 of a pound more protein. Now that's going to cost me about 2 cents per gram of rumen-protected methionine. I just checked that out from 2 different sources here last week, and it can vary anywhere from 2 to 2.5 cents, depending on the company and the markup, and once it gets to your farm gate. Generally, a lot of us will feed 10 or 12 grams, so if I feed 10 grams to keep the math simple, that's going to cost me 20 cents. And so I got 35 cents more back in milk protein, and therefore I've made 15 cents on my cow. And so I think that's a pretty good return on investment there. If I get 2/10, I just made 30 cents. So therefore I've got a nice increase there as well. So usually a methionine is the first one we look at. lysine will be slightly more expensive there, and you'll be adding more of it. So people are cautious on lysine, and that's why a lot of dairy farmers and consultants look at blood meal, because it's a very high level of rumen-protected lysine in it. Well, let's then talk briefly about milk components, how you can use them and interpret them. So here we go, our last part of the webinar. If you do the math tonight or this weekend when you go home, and that is, you see this ratio, the protein to fat ratio. If it is under 0.9, that means the butter, fat, and milk protein tests are almost equal. Something's going on. You're missing milk fat, and you can look through all these strategies. We've talked them already. However, you're missing fat, and that still has a value of about $1.70 a pound. If that number is below 0.75, you're missing milk protein, and that's going to cost you some real money. And I've got an example for both situations there. Let's say your cows are producing a 4 butterfat test, and your milk protein is 2.9, you're below 0.75. Conversely, in the upper example there, you can see they're almost equal 1 to 1. And again, something is missing. And your job, your nutritionist, your veterinarian, your consultant needs to be the detective out there and determine where can I find this product. Another thing I like to do for dairy farmers, and that is to get out your DHI sheets and look for any cows in which the milk protein test, and this is true milk protein, is 0.2 of a point higher than milk fat. And I call it inverted or inversion. In other words, they flipped on me here. So an example there listed, you can see a true protein at 3.1%, milk fat 2.8%. They are inverted. And that butterfat test should be 3.7 instead of 3.1. So I'm leaving a lot of money on the table there. I then go through, and I got 4 cows or 400 cows, I will circle every cow that's inverted. And if that's in excess of 10%, you better start looking for rumen acidosis or low dry matter intakes or something else going on out there on your farm. If you feed these polyunsaturated fats, I could have put this in, but if you see this, PUFAs, it can reduce butterfat test, but the good news is your cow is still healthy. So if you got a low butterfat test, let's say it's 3.3, and that's because you're feeding lots of roasted soybeans or cottonseed, the cows are still healthy. Manure looks normal, but your butterfat test is way down. And this is my guideline number. Your models will predict this for you. If you have more than 500 grams of PUFAs coming from all sources, corn silage, corn grain, coming from soybeans, fuzzy cottonseed, if you're over 500 grams, you're in no man's zone. The research from Cornell says it doesn't take much of these conjugated linoleic acids. These are the C18, and they have a unique structure to them, but we'll leave it at that. So if you have a lot of that, all you have to do is feed 5 or 10 grams. So if you got 5 or 10 of the grams of that PUFAs that get through the rumen end up being converted over to the trans-cis forms that are not desirable, you can drop their butterfat test by half a full point, like from 3.7 to 3.2. Just an amazing research done a number of years ago at Cornell Research. Another thing to think about is what I call free oil. Free oil is, they're not giving it away. Basically, it means that the oil has been ruptured out of the cell of the plant. And certainly distillers' grains would fit that. Vegetable oils, especially if they've been ground or processed or broken, and extruded soybeans fit right into that. And so my magic number is under 220 grams of free oil. And that'll become important here when you start feeding, for example, raw or roasted soybeans. And then, of course, you've got the inert fat sources, and there's just a boatload of them on the market now. Blends of C16, 0, which is palmitic acid or palm oil, C18, which is stearic oil, and you'll see blends of those two. And now Michigan State says you should be adding some C18-1, that's oleic acid, that is an unsaturated fatty acid, and that is usually rumen protected, and they can raise butterfat test. Risk factors, well, we'll let you take a look at those at your leisure. These are all negative factors that can cause problems in the rumen and comes through the fiber digestibility and dry matter intake. So short particle size, not effective fibers here, affecting the pH here, too much starch, high levels of rumensin, your feeding pattern, like slug feeding. Certainly we see some of this on the robotic feeders because they get a slug of grain, typically 6, 8, 10 pounds spread across the day, or even higher levels as high as 20. And then, of course, we already covered all these neat things, and that is looking at your source of fats and oils you're added. And we went through all this as well. So certainly these are I caught them grouped into Rumen risk factors. And actually, I borrowed that slide from Dr. Adam Locke at a Cornell conference a number of years ago. So let's start wrapping up now, and that is, what about MUNs, milk urea nitrogen? What a powerful tool. Because a milk urea nitrogen is going to tell you if you are capturing the dietary protein, in most cases, or urea, or feedstuffs that are non-protein nitrogens, and capturing them and doing it very efficiently. Our targets keep marching down. It used to be 12 to 16, used to be 10 to 14. We're now saying 8 to 12. And that's where I'd like to have my MUNs looking, coming off my bulk tank. If you're on DHI, I'd like to have it run on DHI because I want to see if my heifers, early lactation heifers, have a different MUN value than my mature cows in mid or late lactation. That could be a very important detective fraction to do. What's too low and what's too high? I say under 8, you might be low, starving the rumen bacteria. They aren't getting enough ammonia, not getting enough amino acids to get the job done. If it's over 16, some earlier work would indicate from the Ohio State some impacts on fertility. And of course, there's some energy losses because I take a small amount of energy to produce milk urea nitrogen coming through the bloodstream. And those are your areas to explore. We covered those already. I would be remiss not to mention this one. Dr. Dick Walls put this slide together. This is actually the University of Illinois herd. And if you get your bifocals on, you can see a rhythm to our components coming off our herd, and that's called heat stress. And so you can see in June and July and August, you can see that we have big dips, typically about 0.3 of a point on milk fat, and in some cases, 0.2 or 1/10 of a point of protein. So certainly that's another factor that will affect how many pounds in the summer of milk components that you're going to get to sell to your co-op or your milk processor. So the last one here is fresh cows. Take a look at this. Examples are on the bottom, and then we'll tell you what they are. So if these cows have high butterfat tests in the first 40, 60 days after calving, what that cow is doing is she is mobilizing body fat excessively, and as a result, she ends up resulting in a high butterfat test and just a normal milk protein. And so normally that value, and this comes from Ken Nordland's group in Wisconsin, a normal value, if you divide protein into fat, would be 1.25, or if you use my number, a 0.8. These are inverse of each other. So you can see that example there. That would be fairly normal. And if you take a look at examples down here you can see a ratio 1.31. There's a 4.2 butterfat test with a 3.2 protein. Here's a really high one, 4.5. In fact, get your red pencil out. If you want to take and circle, look at your fresh cows, and if any of them are over 4.5, shame on you. Shame on you, because these cows are being forced to mobilize, I would argue, too much body condition, and that only can, the good news is you might raise butterfat tests. The bad news is you may lead to ketosis, fatty liver, and other metabolic disorders. So Iowans, let's go to our take-home message, and they are, number one, evaluate your current milk fat, milk protein levels in your herd, both the percentages, looking at the data, and how close are you to that target 6.5. Makes no difference which breed of cow you have. That's kind of the magic goal you want to look at here in the future. Number two, see if there's some economic opportunities. Can you build your milk check? Remember, those milk prices I showed you were class 3, and of course all of us can add components and milk quality values to that as well. And then finally, consider ways and sources to increase milk components on your farm. And of course, do it economically. Should you feed extra fat? Should you be looking at the oil seeds? Should you be looking at rumen protected amino acids? Should I be looking at a source of RUP from a feedstuff that can I bring into the ration as well? So here's another way of doing it. This is a crossbreeding, a program that I was trying to launch at Illinois. It never really took off, but you can see the front half of the cow is Holstein and the back half is Jersey. So as a result, I get the high components from the mammary gland, but she eats like a Holstein cow and really puts the feed away. So I'm not quite sure if somebody want to buy into that research there, but no question, crossbreeding is another tool to increase milk protein, but our geneticists say do not breed for percent protein or percent fat. Breed for pounds or kilograms of fat and protein to make the most economic sense. So with that, I am done with my presentation here, and we are ready to take questions. And I think, Fred, you're back online, and I'll turn the program back to you and decide where you want to go.
Thank you, Mike. We had a couple questions that had come early. We've had the derecho. We know we're going to have some damaged corn, and a lot of it's down. We're going to have some high ash levels in our silage. What do we need to be looking for, and is there a way to mitigate that?
Well, I tell you, Fred, it's we saw the news. By the way, we have some of that in northern Illinois also, but not nearly to the extent that your coworkers in Iowa got hit. The answer is there's no easy way of picking that back up. Hopefully, some of that corn gooseneck would come back up, so it allows you to maybe cut it at a more typical height. But many our farmers for corn side are going to have to go down and get it. And so go after it, get it, and if it's high in ash content, the good news is that we now have a correction factor for NDF, so we can correct that. It might have some impact on the fermentation because of ash, depending on what's with the dirt. You know, do we have other kinds of bacteria that are coming in as well? So it's a tough one, Fred. There's not much you can do about that. Your dairymen are going to just have to go out and get that crop. I'm guessing, Fred, you're going to see some of these people having to cut it one way. The Kemper heads may not be able to pull it up like we'd like to have it and get it and cut it at a normal height. So there's not much I can do with high ash other than I definitely put a preservative in it to make sure I get a good fermentation going in case there's something with the ash that would have some negative effects as far as that goes. Another question I saw pop up here had to do with the crossbreeding program, and certainly you can increase components. And this is always dangerous, Fred, but the research would say, yes, it will increase component. We have a really good registered Holstein herd here in our state. They're milking close to 300 cows, and they had jerseys, and then they got some crossbreds in there. And so we looked at their data 2 years ago, and sure enough, the crossbred cows produced the most pounds of fat and pounds of protein, pretty significantly too. And as a result, they were quite pleased with that. And then besides that, they got out of some of the inbreeding concerns we have with Holsteins and Jerseys. By the way, they had Holsteins, Jerseys, and crossbreds. So they had all three cows there. They only had about 25 or 30 Jerseys, but they had about 150 Holstein, and the rest were crossbreds. So it was a pretty interesting sample, and he presented that at one of our dairy meetings. And Fred, I thought, let me just point, I think there was another question that you had commented on here, and hot weather. What can you do with the hot weather? Well, the good news is we're just about out of the woods here, but certainly we can still get some pretty hot weather in September. The big one I'm really promoting, and that is the positive DCAT. I think the research is solid on that. So remember, in dry cows, you want a DCAT somewhere around minus 50 per kilogram. On milking cows, I want that over 350. And that usually means buffers, both potassium carbonate and sodium bicarb or sodium sesquicarbonate to raise that on up. And it looks like it really improves electrolyte balance in those cows. We can also look at trying to add some grain if there's room for it, because we know forages and low-quality forages just generate more heat. So anything you and I can do to cut the heat load on these cows by looking at such things as more digestible BMR corn sides, BMR sorghum, lower lignin alfalfas would be a plus here. Feeding some extra fat, especially if it's rumen-friendly fat, would be a way to get more energy into those cows under heat stress. So those would be the strategies we'd have here. I see we have one more question came in here. Fred, did you want to read that?
Yeah, we've got in fresh cows.
Or I can read it too.
In fresh cows, at what percent fat in our colored breeds should we start to be concerned? You mentioned 4.5% in Holsteins.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and the right answer is I don't know. I don't know. But as a thumb rule, I would use something like a 0.5 over 0.5 to 0.7 over the herd average. So if you're Holstein 4 or 5, that'd be a herd that would typically be about a 4% herd for Holsteins. So if they were color breed, if they're running 4.3, 4.4, or jerseys, that means they'd be somewhere around 5. If your jerseys are sitting up around 4.8, that probably gets you somewhere around 5.3, 5.4. So it's a really great question, and that's how I would swag it and estimate it. I've never seen good numbers. And by the way, that 4.5 is my number. So all those numbers you can blame on me. But if you're a dairy farmer, you just can't say higher butterfat test. You got to put benchmarks in. So great question. I would say probably 0.5 to 0.7 points over the herd average. And I like the herd average because some Holstein herds are now 4.1. So obviously then a 4.5 probably isn't really too much of a concern if your whole herd's running a 4.1, 4.2. And of course we know some of those Danish jerseys, they'll run 5.5. So that's the beauty of working off your herd average. So that's a good question as well.
And we had another question in. Some nutritionists using a new metric, pounds of fat and protein, DMI, or vice versa. What's your thoughts?
Wow, a great question. I see the source of the question, and he's really thinking there. That really kind of mirrors feed efficiency. We'll do feed efficiency on pounds of milk, but the question's a very valid one. What we should probably do is take and, instead of using for the numerator, instead of using pounds of milk, 3.5, or energy-corrected milk, we'd use pounds of solids, and then divide that by the dry matter intake, and that would give me a number as well. So this is always scary for me to do here, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. So if I've got a herd that is giving me 6.5 pounds of solids, and it's eating 50 pounds of dry matter, that number is going to be, and if I had an adding machine, it would go even faster, but that's going to be about a point, somewhere about a 0.13. 0.13, so I'm getting 0.13 pounds of solids from the dry matter I'm consuming. I'd even go a step further to a person who raised the question and maybe just do it for fat and protein separately. Just see how efficient my cows are in taking dry matter to fat and take it to protein. And then you can that might give me another analytical answer that I could use out there. So it's a really, really good question. Good question, and that's one nice thing about doing webinars. I think I learned something. That's something I'll look at, and I've never seen it in a research paper at this point.
Okay, we've got one more question from the same source. You can go ahead and read that and tell us what your thoughts are.
Yep. Yeah, the question is, can we use fat and milk protein ratios for fresh cows other than fat alone? And I think the answer is yes. I think but I tend to keep them separate on that. I look at the fat because we know in the first 30, 40, 50 days, high-producing cows are going to mobilize body fat. So I think we can use that as a tweak to maybe estimate kind of how much is being mobilized. And yes, you can actually measure that. It gets a little expensive, but you can actually measure NEFAs. And it's done all the time in research study. We can measure non-steroid fatty acids. If it gets over 1.2, and that's kind of the trigger number, you're in trouble. You're mobilizing way, way too much as far as that goes. I think you can look at milk protein separately. I go back to the North Carolina data that says, wow, if the protein typically is 3.1 true protein, then you can go in and go with it as far as that goes. So I think I would keep them separate because I think they tell me two different things as far as that goes. But if I do a ratio, obviously, if the butterfat's up 0.4 of a point above the herd average and protein's down 0.2 of a point, wow, that's going to be a really wide ratio. And again, I haven't played much with that, but it could be done. It could be done.
Okay, I thank you again, Dr. Hutjens, for the presentation and going through the questions with us. I would mention that this program will be archived and will be on the ISU Extension Dairy Team website. It'll take us a couple of days to get it, probably by the middle of next week. And remind everybody that the next program will be with evaluating what the silage looks like for this season there in October. Again, thank you, Dr. Hutjens, and for our listeners, we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.